Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So before we
Go
get,
for it, Arlen.
he does very well. So, couple of things, I suppose. First of all, the context in which we're in is this section where God commands Abraham regarding the covenant of circumcision. And how he did this at the tender age of 99. And there's something else in terms of these comments by Torah T'mimah, and that is a certain foundational assumption that Judaism makes, and that is how we look at the commandments. And what does that mean for us as human beings, as Jews, in terms of how we view the commandments, each one of us, or how they want us, how the rabbis certainly want us to understand the commandments. And that is to understand that we are being told to do something by our divine commander. And so the choice of doing it or not doing it has great implications. That in fact, doing the commandments is a demonstration of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And that they take that extremely seriously, so that distinctions start to be made with scriptural commandments, commandments that are sometimes called in Aramaic deoraita, meaning from the Torah, as having a certain authority and implication, and the other commandments that are considered rabbinic, which are called derabanan, which basically are strictures and additions to what is actually written in the Torah. And there's a distinction in terms of the implications. There's a very practical distinction in that if you violate a commandment in the Torah, and this gives you some idea of how seriously the Torah itself takes these commandments, and how our tradition understands it, is that there are in fact certain punishments, consequences that come about from violating these particular rules. Some of those are of divine nature, and some of those are to be administered by a religious court, or simply a court, and human beings, in other words. And that some of those punishments are extremely severe for violating these commandments. But it creates an environment in which you recognize that you have obligations. And those are called chiyuvim, right? You have obligations. Some of those obligations are daily. Some of them are based on a time of day. There are various circumstances that involve observing those commandments and doing that seriously. And speaking sort of on a practical level, this is something we have to decide for ourselves as we develop our own personalities and our relationship to the world, etc., etc. How do we choose to view these things? As far as rabbinic strictures, most of which have to do with additional layers of either practice or not practice, etc., those do not have the same authority as, of course, the divine commandments. The authority of those comes from God. The authority of the rabbis comes from the fact that in the Torah itself, it speaks about the sages of the day, etc., and how we are bound to observe what they say to us. This is in the Torah itself. Maimonides points this out as to the nature of the authority of the rabbis. But nevertheless, there's a distinction. Now, what's going to happen in the course of our studying is that Torah T'mimah is going to mention there are also good practices. These are not halacha, they're not mitzvot, okay, they're not counted as mitzvot, as commandments, but they are sometimes when the literature talks about it, it talks about it in that sense, but it is not supposed to be understood that way, although it can be confusing. And Torah T'mimah is going to try and clarify that. So these I could certainly say more about this. I think that it implies a certain attitude. So, for example, what I will say is that when you have an obligation, right, a chovah, when you fulfill that obligation, the word that we use in Hebrew is yotzei, meaning yotzei literally means to go out. In other words, you have fulfilled that obligation. You're no longer in the space where you have an obligation to fulfill. It is a whole way of looking at reality, looking at our lives, looking at our purpose, looking at our significance, etc. And you can understand possibly that the notion of having divine commandments to fulfill, noting that we have, in fact, an obligation that comes from the very source of creation, the very source of the universe to fulfill, puts a lot of significance to these particular acts. And if I'm correct in saying that one of the things we need more than anything else as human beings is to be able to answer the question, what purpose do I have in this world? And the answer then becomes to fulfill these commandments. And still gives you a lot of space for other things too. But essentially, to understand that your life is a fulfillment of the potential to have this relationship with the divine, and that you yourself then take on a certain high level of significance. And as I've said at other times, to understand the fact that we are created in the divine image, meaning that we, in performing these commandments, in living the life that the Torah would want us to live, we can become a conduit for the divine into the world. And that's extremely significant. There's, again, if I'm articulating this well, then hopefully you can begin to understand the beauty of all of this and its profound nature in terms of making life worthwhile. And especially given the fact that there are many circumstances that challenge that proposition of how worthwhile life is. But it depends on what are your criteria for what makes life worthwhile. So, having given that whole big spiel, I will get into the text. So we have a Torah T'mimah to do on something that we did actually read above the line, where God tells Abram at this point, he says, Vaya Tamim, be perfect. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, said Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, B'sha'ah she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avraham Avinu, at the moment when the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Abraham, our patriarch, Hitalech lefanai v'heyei tamim, walk before me and be perfect. Achazto ra'ada, trembling seized him. We did do this in our previous lesson, right? In other words, he was saying to Abraham, right, that you have to be act in a perfect way. Amar, and he said, he thought to himself, Abraham thought to himself, Shema yesh bi davar meguneh. Perhaps I have something in me that is reprehensible. Kevan she'amar lo ve'etna briti beni uveinecha. But once God said to him, I will place my covenant between you and your offspring, nitkarera da'ato, he became calm. He was able to be calm. So here's what Torah T'mimah has to say. Mevu'ar pashut. It is quite clear, right? We can explain it clearly. The Shem Tamim, that this noun, Tamim, perfect, this word Tamim, Kolel includes Shnei Inyanim. There are two basic aspects to perfection here in this context. Ha'echad, the first one, Tmimut Hada'at v'yishrat hanefesh. That is to say, perfection of understanding or knowledge, right? That you're perfecting yourself in terms of your knowledge and understanding. V'yishrat hanefesh, and I believe what it means is that your soul, literally yashar means straight, the uprightness of your soul. In other words, that you have gotten rid of evil elements within your character. You've overcome those. So You've gained in knowledge, you have tremendous knowledge, and you also have good behavior, amazing kindness, decency, etc. Kamo, and we have an example, the Yaakov ish tamim. It says in the Torah, Jacob was a ish tam, and explaining, right? Tamim. Okay, so that's one example here. And the idea, even though in the course of that narrative, I can't help saying it, right? He seems anything but that. But apparently, he was someone who was working on developing his knowledge and his understanding. And in fact, that does happen. Ultimately, he realizes that life isn't about some of the things he did as a young person. And in fact, he pays dearly for those particular behaviors. And that's part of his growing in understanding, etc. So whether Tam means, and of course, in the context, it appears that he is, right? Exactly how this means, maybe we'll take a look at it when we actually get to the Jacob narratives, and we'll have a better understanding of why the Torah says that he was an Ish Tam. Another example in the Torah, Tamim tihya im Hashem. You shall be perfect with the Lord. Now, I think it means straightforward, essentially straightforward. And what concerns me mainly is the degree to which we make implied commitments, we make commitments and don't fulfill them. So that would be an example of not being perfect with God. That when you make a commitment, right, you fulfill it and you realize it. It isn't just saying it because it sounds nice or meaning it at the time, which often I think is the situation. And then when things happen, you forget it, you forget you made the commitment, or you just don't think it's that important. We don't take ourselves, this is a case of not taking yourself seriously. Uchedome and other some similar examples. V'gam moret mimut haguf. So this is the second idea, that it refers to the perfection of the body, v'ha'evarim, and your limbs. So in other words, that the body is essentially in perfect condition. Right? Sounds to me like the Latin, if I'm saying it correctly, mens sana. Let me think. Can I think about it? I can't think of the rest of it. But it basically means in a healthy body, a healthy mind in a healthy body, right? Oh, mens sana in corpora sane, right? That's the Latin, or at least an approximation of the Latin. Kamose tamim. So there's an example, right? A perfect sheep. In other words, it doesn't have blemishes. Keves tamim, right? A a um, a perfect calf. Okay. Ukedome, and likewise, similar examples. V'lachen, and for this reason, כשאמר לו הקדוש ברוך הוא והיה tamim, when the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Abraham, and be pure, right? Chashav, so remember we said in our previous lesson, be pure can mean you need to be that way, or if you do what I'm about to tell you, you will be pure. It's a different way to understand it. Okay, but anyway, this is taking a different take on this. It says, and when the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, and be pure, Chashav, he thought, Shema kavanat hakadosh baruch hu, that the intention of the Holy One, blessed be He, al tmimut hanefesh, that He was referring to being perfect, that He was telling him to be perfect in the purity of his soul, ushleimut, right? That in that sense, kedat ushleimut hadat et Hashem, and being completely knowledgeable of the perfection of knowledge of God. Achaz Torah, in that case, right, this trembling seized him al chesronozeh, on his lack of what he felt regarding this. And of course, I mean, who are we, right? In the presence of God, we wither into nothing, right? Umikevan she'amar lo ve'etna briti, but once he said to him, I will place my covenant in you, right? I will give you my covenant, etc. Vesof hayon shekritat ha-brit haita al derech hamilah, and the fact that at the end of saying be perfect, he said, and the way you're going to be perfect is by practicing circumcision, right? Hevin, so he understood, shekavanat halashon v'heye tamim, that the intention of this expression, and be perfect, ka'e rak al tmimut haguf, that it only referred to being perfect in body, nitkarara dato. And at that point he calmed down, she'en bo chesron b'kinyane hanefesh, that he was not referring to any lack in the acquisition, that is to say, or should I say, acquisitions of the soul. That was not what God was demanding of him to be able to actually attain that. But in practicing circumcision, and remember, we discussed this at length as to how the removal of the foreskin is actually a perfection of the body. And we discussed the fact that under normal circumstances, we don't consider removing something to be actually perfecting it. But in this case, it is. Okay. So let's take a look here at the next one. There's not a lot of Torah T'mimah on it, so we'll take a look. V'heye tamim, right? Amar Rabbi Hoshaya commenting on this phrase, Kol hamitamim atzmo, right? I don't think it's mitmayem, but it could be. Kol hamit yamem atzmo doesn't sound right, but it could be. So anyone who perfects himself, right, who tries, sha'a omedet lo. So we're going to explain this particular expression. The hour stands for him. And I'm not going to explain that right now because I want to do Torah T'mimah and see how he does it. And if we need to explain a little more, we will. So if you do everything you can to yourself, right, to act in a perfect way, the hour stands in you, stands for you. Shineemar, as it says, Hitalech lefanai, walk before me, veheye tamim, and be perfect, v'chaduktiv batre, and what is written right after that is v'hayita la'av hamon goyim, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. So there's something that's a reward. I also wondered to myself if, given the fact that Abraham wanted to have a child more than anything else with him and Sarah, that saying that he would, in fact, father a multitude of nations, that was something that he wanted, and we're going to go now right into the Torah T'mimah and see what it says. Okay, here we go. Yitachein, it would appear, the midayek, right, that he is looking carefully, right? He's analyzing carefully, usamich, and it's dependent, right? This particular statement is attached to the Amar HaKodim, that a statement that is said prior to this, the Gemara Kan, in the Gemara, in this particular reference. Here it is. Kol hamitamim akat mitmayem. I don't know. Forgive me. I don't know how to pronounce this. Himself, right? Anyone who perfects himself. Hakadosh Baruch Hu mitamem imo. Right? In other words, that God helps him in that process. Right? Together along with him, God will support him. Shine'emar, as it says, and this is the second book of Samuel, chapter 22, Im chasid tit chasad, right? With a pious person, you create piety, right? Or you act with piety. That would make more sense, right? With a chassid, with someone who is, and by the way, the word chesed means kindness, and I love to translate the term chassid not so much as a pious person, but as someone who practices kindness. You are kind to the one who practices kindness. And the point of this is, she'akadosh baruch hu mefik ritzono u'mishalto, that what God does is he brings out this person's desire, what he wants, and his wishes. In other words, that's what this means. That God will take what you want, what you wish for, what you yearn for, and bring it to pass. V'zehu habiur, and this is the explanation of hasha'a omedet lo, that the hour stands for him. In other words, the moment that he's existing, the time in which he is existing, will support him. And that support is that God will will fulfill this person's wishes and his yearnings and his desires. And presumably, because he is perfecting himself, this person is, his desires and his wishes are totally appropriate, etc. And that's where we're going to end today. And we'll take a look next time at the very next verse. So, okay, gonna take care of that. And I'm going to stop the share. And if you have any comments for the record. Morris?
No, it's good.
Okay. All right. David, I know sometimes you have questions. Harlan, Kathy? Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.